Imagine the most powerful empire on Earth, simply deciding to stop existing. No war, no invasion. It's just one man, one speech, and a flag coming down forever. It is a quiet night in Moscow, the kind of quiet that settles only when something immense is ending. Snow drifts onto red brick and cobblestone, muffling the city on the edge of transformation. Inside the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev sits at a desk, preparing words that will erase a nation. In hours, he will no longer lead a country because the country itself will cease to be. On Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev delivered his resignation. Not with drama or crowds storming gates, just a calm farewell, televised to a stunned world. He spoke of principle, of disintegration. And then it was over. Moments later, the red hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin. In its place rose Russia's tricolor. In minutes, the USSR, the colossus that shaped the 20th century, dissolved. Not conquered, not destroyed, it simply ran out of reasons to hold together. To understand this sunset, we must go back to its sunrise. How the Soviet Union was born in revolution, grew into a global force, and why, in the end, it could not survive its own contradictions. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. To tell this story properly, we have to travel back more than a century, to the dying days of another empire. In the early 20th century, Russia was ruled by the Romanov dynasty, a royal family that had governed a vast empire across 2 continents for 300 years. Tsar Nicholas II sat on the throne, surrounded by ceremony and wealth, presiding over a nation that was, in many ways, crumbling beneath him. Russia was industrializing, but slowly and unevenly. Its peasant class, the overwhelming majority of its population, lived in conditions of crushing poverty and near-feudal dependency. Its military was being humiliated in a costly and disastrous war against Germany on the Eastern Front. And in its cities, in the cold and crowded tenements, something was stirring. The ideas of Karl Marx had been traveling through Russian intellectual circles for decades. The notion that history was driven not by kings and emperors, but by class struggle, by the conflict between those who owned the means of production and those whose labor made everything possible, had taken deep root among a generation of revolutionaries who believed that the Tsarist system was not merely unjust, but historically doomed. Among them was a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history by his revolutionary name, Lenin. Lenin was not a sentimental man. He was a theorist and an organizer, impatient with idealism and obsessed with strategy. He believed that a revolution did not happen on its own. It had to be seized, directed, and controlled by a disciplined vanguard of professional revolutionaries who understood the forces of history and knew how to harness them. He had spent years in exile, in Switzerland, in London, in the cold libraries of Europe, studying, writing, and waiting. The moment came in 1917. The Russian Empire collapsed in 2 stages. First, in February 1917, popular unrest, military mutinies, and food shortages forced the abdication of Nicholas II. A provisional government took power, committed to continuing the war and delaying social reform. But the provisional government made a catastrophic error. It kept Russia in the war. In October of 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks struck. In a swift and carefully organized seizure of power, they took control of the government, the telegraphs, the railway stations, the bridges. By morning, they held Petrograd. A new age had begun. But seizing power and holding power are 2 different things. What followed was years of brutal civil war. The Bolsheviks, the Reds, faced a loose coalition of their enemies, the Whites backed in parts by foreign intervention from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. The country was devastated. Famine swept the land. Millions died. But in the end, the Bolsheviks won. They had organization, ideology, and ruthlessness on their side. By the early 1920s, they were in control of most of the former Russian Empire. In December of 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally declared. It was, at least in theory, a federation of Soviet republics united by common ideology and common governance. In reality, it was a centralized state controlled by the Communist Party, which tolerated no rivals, no dissent, and no alternative vision of the future. It was, its founders claimed, the first step on the road toward a global communist society, a world without class, without exploitation, without the old hierarchies of kings and capitalists. It was a bold, extraordinary, and in many ways deeply violent project, and it was only just beginning. Lenin died in 1924, leaving behind a power vacuum that would be filled, after years of internal party struggle, by a man who was in many ways the opposite of everything the revolution had promised. Joseph Stalin was not a visionary intellectual like Lenin. He was a survivor, cunning, suspicious, brutal, and supremely patient. He had risen through the party apparatus not through the force of his ideas, but through the quiet accumulation of organizational power. By the late 1920s, he had outmaneuvered all his rivals and consolidated control over the Soviet state. What Stalin did with that power was extraordinary and horrifying. He set about transforming the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into an industrial superpower in the space of a single generation, and he was willing to pay any price to achieve it. His program of forced collectivization tore apart the countryside. Seizing farms from peasants and consolidating them into state-controlled collective farms, the resistance was crushed with savage efficiency. In Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and across the breadth of the Soviet grain belt, a famine swept through the land in the early 1930s that killed millions of people. In Ukraine alone, historians estimate that somewhere between 3 and 5 million people died, a catastrophe that Ukrainians came to call the Holodomor, the death by hunger. And yet the factories rose between 1929 and 1941. The Soviet Union underwent one of the most dramatic industrial transformations in history. Steel mills, power plants, railways, and munitions factories appeared across the landscape. Cities swelled with workers arriving from the countryside. The Soviet economy, by certain measures, grew at a staggering rate. Stalin called it socialism in one country, and he demanded that every Soviet citizen participate in the great project of building it, whether they wanted to or not. The human cost of Stalin's rule was not limited to collectivization. Through the 1930s, Stalin launched a series of purges that swept through the party, the military, the intelligentsia, and ordinary Soviet society. Millions were arrested, sent to the brutal labor camps of the Gulag system, or executed. Entire categories of people, kulaks, priests, engineers, party members suspected of disloyalty, were destroyed. The terror was not merely political. It was a kind of permanent organized fear that permeated every level of Soviet life. And then came the war. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, driving deep into Soviet territory. The early months were catastrophic. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. The Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow. Leningrad was placed under a siege that would last nearly 900 days. The scale of death was almost incomprehensible. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had lost an estimated 27 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. A toll that no other nation in the conflict came close to matching, but the Soviet Union did not fall. It absorbed the blow, regrouped, and then in a series of brutal, grinding campaigns, pushed the Germans back. The battles of Stalingrad and Kursk were turning points of world historical significance. By 1945, Soviet forces had fought their way to Berlin. The Soviet Union had suffered more than any nation in the war and had emerged from it as one of the two dominant powers on Earth. The age of the superpowers had begun. What followed was the Cold War, not a single conflict, but a global struggle between two visions of the future. On one side, the United States and its allies, capitalism, liberal democracy, the free market. On the other, the Soviet Union and its expanding sphere, communism, state planning, the party. For nearly half a century, these two systems faced each other across every theater of geopolitical competition in Europe and Asia, in Africa and Latin America, in the skies and in the deepest silence of outer space. But what did it actually mean to live inside the Soviet Union? What was daily life like in a country that claimed to be building the future of humanity, as the Soviet state touched nearly every aspect of a citizen's existence? The economy was entirely controlled by the state. There were no private businesses, no free markets in the Western sense. All major industries were nationalized. All prices were set by central planners in Moscow. All production was governed by a sequence of 5-year plans that told the entire economy what to make, how much to make, and where to send it. In theory, this meant that resources would be allocated rationally without the wastefulness of capitalist competition. In practice, it created chronic shortages, bureaucratic rigidity, and a gray landscape of consumer goods that were perpetually in short supply or simply unavailable. The party controlled not only the economy, but culture, education, and the flow of information. Newspapers, radio, television, all of it was state-controlled and shaped to serve the ideological needs of the system. History was rewritten when inconvenient. Artists and writers who strayed too far from acceptable themes risked denunciation, imprisonment, or worse. The borders of intellectual life were not always clearly drawn, but everyone understood that certain things could not be said. Certain ideas could not be published. Certain truths could not be acknowledged in public. And yet this is important. The Soviet Union was not simply a society of suffering and repression. Millions of Soviet citizens lived ordinary lives, raised children, went to work, stood in line for bread, watched football on state television, and felt, in their own way, a genuine pride in what their country had accomplished. The Soviet system provided universal education, universal healthcare, guaranteed employment, and heavily subsidized housing. Illiteracy, which had been rampant in Tsarist Russia, was effectively eliminated. Women entered the workforce and professions at rates that the Western world would not match for decades. The state was paternalistic and controlling, but it delivered certain concrete material guarantees that were not nothing, especially to people whose parents and grandparents had known hunger and serfdom. And then there was the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit, a moment that sent a shock of wonder and alarm through the Western world. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel into space, returning to a hero's welcome that felt too many Soviet citizens. Like proof that their system worked, that the sacrifice and the discipline and the collective effort had produced something genuinely magnificent. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. It had a space program. It had an Olympic machine that collected gold medals like trophies of systemic superiority. It was a real power, a genuine rival. And for a time, it seemed entirely possible that its model of society might be the one that prevailed. But beneath the achievements, the fissures were already forming. Stalin died in 1953, and the world he had built began, slowly and unevenly, to change. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's crimes, the purges. The cult of personality, the terror, and the shock of that speech traveled through the Soviet system like a tremor. If the father of Soviet socialism had been a murderer and a liar, what did that say about the system he had built? These questions could not be answered publicly, but they circulated in whispers, in kitchens, in the private spaces that the state could not reach. The Soviet economy began to show its limitations more clearly. The command economy was good at certain things, mobilizing resources for specific industrial goals, building infrastructure on a massive scale, developing weapons and rockets, but it was poor at responding to changing conditions, at innovating, producing the variety and quality of consumer goods that a modern population expected. As the Western economies boomed in the post-war decades, the gap between life in Moscow and life in West Berlin or Paris or New York grew increasingly visible. The ideology promised a future of abundance. The present was a world of shortages, queues, and bureaucratic inertia. The Soviet leadership under Leonid Brezhnev, who ruled from 1964 until his death in 1982, responded to these challenges largely by pretending they did not exist. The Brezhnev era is sometimes called the period of stagnation, and the name is apt. Reforms were attempted and then abandoned. Corruption spread through the party apparatus. The official rhetoric grew ever more disconnected from the reality of Soviet life. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate the gap between what they were told and what they could see with their own eyes. A kind of pervasive cynicism settled over the country. Everyone performed loyalty to the system, but fewer and fewer people actually believed in it. And then there was Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist government that was losing a civil war. It was a decision that would bleed the Soviet Union for nearly a decade. The Afghan War, like the American War in Vietnam a generation earlier, was a conflict in which a superpower discovered, at enormous cost, the limits of its power. The Soviet military could occupy cities and fight conventional engagements. But it could not pacify a countryside of determined guerrilla fighters supported by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. The war cost tens of thousands of Soviet lives and consumed resources the country could not afford. More than that, it shattered the mythology of Soviet invincibility and deepened the disillusionment of an entire generation. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was in serious trouble. Its economy was stagnating. Its ideology had lost credibility. Its empire was maintained by force rather than conviction. Its leadership was aging and exhausted. And into this landscape in 1985 stepped a man who believed the system could be saved if only it was willing to change. Mikhail Gorbachev was different from his predecessors. He was younger, more energetic, and more honest, at least with himself, about the scale of the problems the Soviet Union faced. He came to power believing that the Soviet system did not need to be replaced but reformed, that its fundamental structure was sound, but that it had been distorted by decades of corruption, secrecy, and mismanagement. He introduced two programs that would define his leadership and ultimately doom the state he was trying to rescue. It was a program of economic reform aimed at making the Soviet economy more efficient, more flexible, more responsive. It allowed limited forms of private enterprise. It decentralized certain economic decisions. But perestroika produced, at least initially, more disruption than improvement. It undermined the existing command economy without replacing it with anything that functioned reliably. Shortages worsened. Inflation appeared. The authority of the central state weakened, without anything stepping in to fill the vacuum. The second reform was glasnost, openness. It was an attempt to introduce greater transparency and freedom of expression into Soviet public life, to allow the press to report more honestly, to permit citizens to acknowledge and discuss problems that had previously been off limits. It was, in many ways, the more radical of the two programs because it unlocked something that could not be relocked. Once the Soviet media began reporting honestly on the crimes of the Stalin era, on the failures of the Afghan War, on the reality of the Chernobyl disaster, which Gorbachev initially tried to conceal, but which glasnost eventually brought into the light, it was impossible to put the lid back on. The Soviet people had been told for 70 years that their system was superior, their leaders wise, their history glorious. And now, suddenly, they were being told something closer to the truth. The effect was not gratitude. It was fury and grief and a demand for more. By 1989 and 1990, the forces that Gorbachev had unleashed were spreading far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union itself. In Eastern Europe, the satellite states that the Soviet Union had dominated since the end of World War II began to break free. Poland held elections. Hungary opened its borders. And then, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The image of East Germans pouring through the checkpoints, weeping and embracing, was watched in living rooms across the Soviet Union. If the satellites could go, what about the republics? What about the nations that were not merely Soviet allies, but constituent parts of the USSR itself? The Soviet Union was not a single country in the way that France or Japan was a single country. It was a collection of 15 republics, each nominally sovereign, each with its own history, its own language, its own national identity, some of them ancient and deeply rooted, others more recently constructed. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the three Baltic republics, had been independent nations until 1940, and they were absorbed by the Soviet Union as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact with Nazi Germany. They had never fully accepted Soviet rule, and now they saw their chance. In 1990, Lithuania declared independence. Estonia and Latvia followed. And across the other republics in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Moldova, movements for sovereignty and independence were gathering strength. Gorbachev was caught in an impossible position. He did not want to use force to hold the Union together, as his predecessors would have done without hesitation. But he also could not simply accept the dissolution of the state he led. He tried to negotiate a new union treaty, a looser arrangement that would give the republics more autonomy while preserving some kind of common framework. He was almost out of time. In August of 1991, the crisis came to a head. A group of hardline Communist Party officials, alarmed by the pending Union Treaty and the ongoing dissolution of Soviet power, launched a coup. On the morning of August 19th, Gorbachev was placed under house arrest at his vacation dacha in Crimea. The coup plotters announced that he was ill and that a state of emergency committee had taken over the government. Tanks rolled into Moscow. But something unexpected happened. The coup failed not because of military resistance, but because of the refusal of the Soviet people, and particularly the people of Moscow and Leningrad, to accept it. And it failed, in particular, because of one man standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament building, Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Republic, who had been feuding with Gorbachev for years, but who now became the focal point of resistance to the coup. Crowds gathered around the parliament, some soldiers defected. The coup plotters, it became clear, had misjudged the moment. They had expected the country to accept the return of the old order. Instead, they found that the old order no longer commanded the fear it once had. Within 3 days, the coup had collapsed. Its leaders were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But the coup, though it failed, had fatally changed everything. It had revealed the fragility of the Soviet state and the depth of the opposition to its continuation. It had destroyed whatever remaining authority the Communist Party possessed. It had given Boris Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, the mantle of the moment. In the weeks that followed, republic after republic accelerated its moves toward independence. Ukraine, by far the largest and most strategically important of the non-Russian republics, held a referendum on December 1st, 1991. Over 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence. That vote, more than any other single event, sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. Without Ukraine, there was no real union to speak of. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a hunting lodge in the Beluga forest in Belarus. What they signed there was extraordinary. A document that simply declared the Soviet Union dissolved and replaced by a loose commonwealth of independent states. They had no formal authority to do this. The Soviet constitution contained no mechanism for such an act. But they did it anyway, because the Soviet Union had, in any meaningful sense, already ceased to function. On December 21st, 11 of the 15 former Soviet republics signed the Almaty Declaration. Formally confirming the end of the USSR, only the Baltic states, which had already achieved internationally recognized independence. In Georgia, which was in the midst of its own internal conflicts, did not join. What had been a single state, the second most powerful country in the world, the other half of the global superpower duopoly, had become 15 separate nations in a matter of weeks. Russia inherited the Soviet seat on the UN Security Council, the nuclear arsenal, and most of the international obligations of its predecessor. But it also inherited the debt, the dysfunction, and the task of rebuilding a post-communist economy from the ruins of the old one. The other republics, from tiny Estonia on the Baltic coast to vast Kazakhstan, stretching across the Central Asian steppe, were suddenly on their own, each carrying its own share of the Soviet legacy, and each facing the enormous challenge of building a new national identity in a functional state from whatever the Soviet era had left behind. For many of the people living through this transition, it was a period of profound disorientation. Citizens who had been raised to believe in one set of values, one history, one identity suddenly found that the country they had been born in no longer existed. Streets were renamed, statues were pulled down, currencies changed, borders shifted. Old certainties evaporated. New ones had not yet arrived. The 1990s would prove to be for much of the former Soviet space. A decade of painful and sometimes violent transformation, economic collapse, ethnic conflict, the rise of oligarchs and organized crime, the slow and uneven construction of new institutions and societies that had never known anything but centralized authority. And on Christmas evening, 1991, the snow fell on the Kremlin and the red flag came down. All of this was still ahead. Gorbachev sat in his office and signed the papers. He gave a speech. He handed the launch codes for the Soviet nuclear arsenal to Boris Yeltsin, and then he drove away. The Soviet Union was over. There is a way of thinking about history that imagines empires and states as permanent things, as structures so vast, so deeply embedded, so interwoven with the fabric of the world that their disappearance is simply unthinkable. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Soviet Union. These were not merely countries. They were systems of power so comprehensive that they shaped the imagination of entire generations. Two people living inside them, and in many ways two people living outside them as well. They felt like constants, like features of the landscape. Like the mountains and the rivers, things that had always been there and would always remain. And then they are gone. Not always in fire and blood, though sometimes in that too. Sometimes they end quietly in offices and conference rooms and hunting lodges, with signatures on papers and flags coming down from poles. Sometimes the end of a world looks less like a catastrophe and more like a slow exhalation. The last breath of something that had been struggling to breathe for a long time. The Soviet Union reshaped the 20th century in ways that are impossible to fully inventory. It gave birth to a geopolitical order that defined the lives of billions of people across 6 decades. It was the crucible in which the Cold War was forged, a conflict that was never purely military, but was also ideological and cultural and psychological, a contest over what kind of future the human race was going to build for itself. It funded independence movements and proxy wars on every continent. It launched the first satellite and the first human into space. It bore the greatest burden of the Second World War. It demonstrated, in ways that were alternately inspiring and horrifying, what a society could do when it mobilized all of its resources toward a single set of goals. Its disappearance transformed the world just as profoundly as its existence had. The United States found itself, briefly and somewhat bewilderingly, as the sole superpower on a unipolar planet. Nations that had spent their entire existence in the shadow of one or the other superpower suddenly had room to maneuver. The former Soviet republics began the long, painful, and still unfinished work of becoming something new. And across the globe, the ideological clarity of the Cold War, for all its terror and rigidity, it had at least been a kind of clarity, gave way to a more complex, more unpredictable, and in some ways more dangerous world. We are still living in the world that the Soviet collapse created. The tensions between Russia and the West that have defined the early 21st century cannot be understood without understanding the humiliation and disorientation that accompanied the Soviet dissolution. The politics of many of the successor states, the democracy that flowered briefly in some and withered in others, the authoritarianisms that took hold, the wars over borders and identities, all of this flows from that moment when the flags came down and the maps were redrawn. But perhaps the deepest lesson of the Soviet story is simpler than any geopolitical analysis can capture. It is a lesson about the distance between the world as it is imagined and the world as it actually exists. The Soviet Union was built on a vision, a genuinely compelling, genuinely idealistic vision of a society without exploitation, without poverty, without the cruelties of class and hierarchy. That vision inspired millions of people in Russia and around the world to sacrifice and to endure and to believe. And yet the gap between the vision and the reality, the gap between the society that was promised and the society that was actually built, proved, in the end, to be unbridgeable. Every powerful nation carries within it a story about itself, a story about what it is, what it stands for, why it deserves to exist. The Soviet Union told itself a story about the march of history, about the liberation of the working class, about the inevitable triumph of socialism over capitalism. When its citizens stopped believing that story, when the gap between the story and the reality became too wide, when the party's claims to moral authority became too hollow, when the promise of a better future collapsed under the weight of an inadequate present, the state lost the consent of the governed. And without that consent, all the tanks and missiles and secret police in the world could not save it. There is, in the end, something quietly humbling about standing at the edge of this history. The Soviet Union was not an abstraction. It was the lives of hundreds of millions of people. People who loved and grieved and hoped and endured, who built cities in the Arctic and launched rockets toward the stars, who wrote poems in languages the world has mostly forgotten, and composed symphonies that still ring in concert halls today. It was a real place, full of real human beings, living under a system that was trying, however brutally, however imperfectly, however dishonestly, to answer some of the most fundamental questions that any society must face. How do we take care of each other? Who deserves what? How do we build something together that none of us could build alone? Those questions did not disappear when the Soviet flag came down. They remain unanswered and urgent in every corner of the world. The Soviet Union failed to answer them, but its failure does not make them any less important. If anything, it makes the asking of them more necessary than ever. On the night of December 25, 1991, a flag was lowered over the Kremlin. A chapter of history closed, and the world continued, changed, uncertain, and searching, as it has always been, for what comes next. History is filled with nations that believed they would last forever. Some change their names and endure. Others fracture into many smaller states. And sometimes, as we saw tonight, even the most powerful empires can simply dissolve when the story that once held them together stops being believed. The Soviet Union reminds us that history can move in the opposite direction as well. Sometimes the name survives only in memory, and the country behind it disappears. If you found this story meaningful, thank you for spending this time with me here on Whispered Chronicles. It's echoes of forgotten lore. And if you enjoy exploring the strange turns of history, the moments when nations rise, transform, or vanish entirely, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. I always enjoy hearing what these stories make you think about. Until the next whisper, stay curious and stay safe.